You can't even afford a lawyer." My dad's laugh echoed through the cold courtroom, bouncing off the oak walls like a physical slap. He stood next to his high-priced legal team, wearing a tailored three-piece suit funded by the very inheritance he had stolen from me. His new wife smirked beside him, adjusting her designer purse. I stood at the petitioner's table completely alone, holding nothing but a beat-up manila folder. My dad's lawyer leaned over, patronizingly offering me a lowball settlement check to spare my dignity. Everyone in that room thought I was a desperate, broke girl standing on the edge of financial ruin. But as the judge took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the official docket, the smirk vanished from my dad's face. The judge didn't look at me with pity. He looked at them with pure, cold judgment. Follow my story until the end to see the exact moment the truth exploded. My name is Veronica. I am 28 years old, and 4 years ago, I learned exactly how cruel the people who share your blood can be. The funeral flowers for my mother were still fresh when my father, Richard, decided to destroy me. She had been the heart of our family, the steady hand that kept my father's corporate empire grounded. But the moment her casket lowered into the earth, the mask slipped. Within 3 months, Richard had remarried Vanessa, a woman younger than his own eldest colleagues, with a sharp smile and a calculating eye for our family trust. Together, they locked themselves in his study, rewriting the legacy my mother spent a lifetime building. I still remember the cold Tuesday morning Richard called me into the office. He didn't look at me as a daughter. He looked at me like a minor inconvenience. He tossed a set of heavily altered documents across the desk, stripping me of my position in the company and my rightful inheritance. When I protested, pointing out my mother's true wishes, he sneered, telling me I was a nobody who would never amount to anything without his wealth. They gave me 24 hours to pack my things and leave the estate. Before we move into how I spent the last 4 years preparing my response, I want to know who is watching. Drop a comment right now and let me know. Have you ever been betrayed by a toxic family member? Now, let me tell you what happened next. Instead of screaming, crying, or throwing a useless tantrum that would only feed their arrogance, I did something they never expected. I vanished. I packed my life into 3 cardboard boxes, walked away from the family mansion, and completely cut off all contact with Richard and Vanessa. For 4 long years, my father and his new wife celebrated their flawless victory. They threw lavish parties, traveled the world on inherited funds, and bragged to their high society friends about how they had successfully purged the dead weight from the Whitaker family fortune. They truly believed I was out there drowning, broken and destitute, begging for table scraps in some dingy apartment. But they mistook my silence for defeat. What they didn't know was that every single ounce of pain and humiliation they inflicted on me became the fuel for my rebirth. I took the meager savings my mother had secretly left me in a private account and invested every single penny into my mind. I enrolled in elite, grueling night classes, dedicating every waking hour to mastering high-stakes corporate fraud and intricate estate law. I didn't just study, I obsessed. I spent my days working behind the scenes as a low-level clerk, catching the eye of a brilliant retired federal mentor who specialized in bringing down corrupt billionaires. Under his guidance, I learned how to track hidden offshore assets, analyze doctored tax returns, and tear apart bulletproof corporate structures. I grew older, sharper, and dangerously quiet. While Richard and Vanessa were busy spending money, I was busy building a legal fortress. I knew that fighting them in a standard court with expensive fees would destroy me, so I waited until I became the weapon myself. The trap was set. 4 years passed, and my father's arrogance finally caught up with him. Greed is a demanding master, and Richard was never satisfied with just the money he had stolen from my mother and me. He began taking massive risks, shuffling funds through complex international networks to evade regulatory oversight. But the financial world changes rapidly, and a sudden, unexpected federal audit hit his corporate empire like a lightning bolt. The auditors flagged millions in missing offshore funds, assets directly linked to the original family estate that my mother had established. Panicked and facing the collapse of his public image, Richard scrambled for an emergency exit. He decided the only way to shield the money from federal seizure was to legally dissolve the remaining family trusts and absorb the capital into a new shell company. However, the legal system has built-in tripwires for corporate maneuvers of this scale. Dissolving a foundational family trust automatically triggers a mandatory, public evidentiary court hearing. Because my mother had been meticulous, my birth name was still permanently embedded in the original corporate charter as a primary beneficiary. Richard's expensive lawyers tried to bypass it, but the court clerk insisted on absolute protocol. A formal legal summons was issued to my name. When Richard and Vanessa saw the notice, they didn't panic. In fact, they laughed. They viewed this mandatory hearing as the perfect opportunity to officially terminate my legal rights to the estate once and for all. Richard assumed I would show up to court looking desperate, empty-handed, and begging for a small cash handout just to survive. He thought he was walking into a routine corporate cleanup. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into an ambush. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the air inside the courthouse was heavy with anticipation. As I walked down the marble corridor, I spotted them. Richard, Vanessa, and their high-priced corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling, were huddled near the entrance, looking like royalty surveying their kingdom. Richard wore his usual custom suit, and Vanessa practically glowed with smug satisfaction. The moment Richard caught sight of me, his eyes narrowed in immediate amusement. I was wearing a modest off-the-rack blazer and carrying nothing but a beat-up manila folder. To them, I looked exactly like the broken girl they had discarded 4 years ago. They stepped forward, blocking my path to the courtroom doors. Vanessa let out a soft, mocking laugh, while Mr. Sterling adjusted his silk tie with practiced condescension. "You can't even afford a lawyer," Richard barked, his voice echoing off the walls loud enough to draw glances from passing clerks. "Look at you, Veronica. You come here thinking you can claim a piece of my empire? You don't even have legal counsel to stand beside you." Mr. Sterling stepped up, patronizingly holding out a printed document. "We are prepared to offer you a minor settlement check for $10,000, Veronica. Sign it now, and spare your dignity before the judge throws you out." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. And I didn't show a single ounce of anger. I simply stared into my father's arrogant eyes, remaining entirely silent as I let their overconfidence build to an absolute peak. The heavy oak doors opened, and we took our places inside the courtroom. Richard, Vanessa, and Mr. Sterling sat confidently at the petitioner's table, surrounded by stacks of leather-bound binders. I sat completely alone at the defense table, laying my worn manila folder flat on the polished wood. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Abraham took his seat, his sharp eyes surveying the room before focusing directly on the docket in front of him. Mr. Sterling stood up immediately, clearing his throat with theatrical confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice echoing authoritatively, "we are here today to finalize the dissolution of the family trust. The defense, as you can see, has failed to retain legal representation. As my client's daughter has no legal standing, no counsel, and no formal training to contest these proceedings, we request a summary motion to dismiss her claims and finalize the asset transfer immediately." He smiled, looking over at Richard, who gave a satisfied nod. They thought it was over. But Judge Abraham didn't sign the paperwork. Instead, he slowly lowered the document, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at Mr. Sterling with cold, unyielding judgment. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice cutting through the silence of the room like ice, "sit down. I have been reviewing the case documentation since 6 o'clock this morning. Your motion to dismiss is not only denied, but your entire petition is currently suspended. Richard's smirk vanished instantly. He leaned forward, his knuckles turning white against the table. Your Honor, there must be a mistake, Sterling stammered, his confidence evaporating. The only mistake here is yours, Judge Abraham countered, tapping a thick, 400-page federal countersuit sitting on his bench. This court did not receive an empty folder. We received an ironclad, meticulously detailed federal countersuit exposing systemic embezzlement, tax fraud, and document forgery committed by your client, and signed off by your own firm over the last 4 consecutive years. The courtroom felt completely airless. Mr. Sterling's hands began to tremble violently as he frantically flipped through the digital copy of the countersuit on his tablet. He searched desperately for the name of the elite law firm or the high-powered federal prosecutor capable of uncovering such buried, classified financial secrets. But as his eyes finally locked onto the official signature block at the bottom of the final page, all the remaining color drained from his face. He stumbled backward slightly, clutching the edge of the mahogany table for support. He turned his head slowly toward my father, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and absolute terror. "Oh my God," Sterling gasped, his voice dropping to a panicked, horrified whisper that echoed in the silence. "Richard, is that really her?" Richard stared at his lawyer in confusion, his anger briefly turning into pure bewilderment. Before he could ask what was happening, Judge Abraham struck his gavel, the sharp sound echoing through the room. "Let the record reflect," the judge announced with authority, looking directly at the defense table, "that the petitioner is not standing before this court unrepresented. Veronica is standing here as the lead pro se litigator on this matter, newly appointed as a special consultant for the federal magistrate overseeing corporate fraud." I stood up slowly, maintaining absolute composure. I reached into my worn manila folder and pulled out a pristine, gleaming federal legal badge alongside my state bar certification, placing them flat on the table for everyone to see. Judge Abraham did not waste a single moment. Looking down at Richard and Vanessa, his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud presented in this countersuit, I am ordering an immediate total freeze on all corporate and personal bank accounts tied to Richard Whitaker. Furthermore, this matter is being officially referred to the federal prosecutor's office for a full criminal grand jury investigation into forgery and grand larceny." Vanessa let out a sharp gasp, burying her face in her hands, while Richard collapsed backward into his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling as his stolen empire vanished in an instant. I packed my folder, looked at my father one last time, and walked out into the sunlight completely vindicated. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever witnessed justice served so perfectly? Comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my victory has reached. Meanwhile, I'm leaving 2 other favorite stories on the screen that will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.